On my 70th birthday, I called my son Desmond and asked a simple question. "Do you want to grab dinner?" He sighed heavily into the phone, claiming he was trapped in an emergency board meeting out of state and could not possibly make it. I told him not to worry about it. I decided to treat myself anyway and drove to the most exclusive steakhouse in Buckhead. I walked into the dining room, but I did not find a quiet table for one. Instead, I found my son. He was not in another state. I was sitting at a table. He was clinking champagne glasses with his wife and her mother dining on my dime. So I walked right up to their table and did something they never expected. What I did next stunned the entire restaurant and set off a chain of events that would end with federal prison sentences. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I did not turn around and run away crying. Crying is a true luxury. Crying is a luxury for people who have not spent 40 years building a commercial real estate empire from the dirt up in Atlanta. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, kept my posture perfectly straight, and walked directly toward their table. The waiter had just set down a massive seafood tower in front of them. Desmond was laughing at something his wife Chloe had said. He lifted his glass of vintage champagne, his custom watch catching the ambient light. Then he finally saw me. The blood drained from my son so fast, he looked completely and utterly terrified. He lowered his glass, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Chloe noticed his panicked expression and turned around. Her fake, perfectly practiced smile froze instantly. Desmond jumped up from his seat, nearly knocking over his water glass. "Mom, what are you doing here? I thought you were staying home tonight," he stammered, wiping his brow. "And I thought you were in Chicago dealing with a corporate crisis." I replied, my voice calm, smooth, and carrying just enough volume for the neighboring tables to hear. "Did your flight get rerouted to a fancy steakhouse in Buckhead tonight?" Chloe recovered her composure faster than my son. She stood up, smoothing down her designer dress, and put on that syrupy, patronizing tone she always used when she wanted to manipulate a situation. "Oh, Mama B, what a huge surprise. We were actually going to surprise you tomorrow morning. We are just celebrating a huge milestone for my fashion boutique tonight. We did not want to bother you with our loud business talk on your special day." I looked at Chloe. Her boutique had been bleeding money for 3 years. The only milestone she was celebrating was surviving another month. Before I could address Chloe, the older woman chimed in. Vivian sat comfortably on the velvet banquette, swirling her wine. She was 65, draped in pearls that Desmond probably paid for, and she wore a look of pure elitist disdain. Vivian had always hated me. She came from a family of debutantes and legacy wealth that had long since dried up, yet she clung to her status like a life raft. "Give the boy a break," Beatrice, Vivian sneered, not even bothering to offer a polite greeting. "You have to understand that Desmond and Chloe operate in high society. They are networking with top-tier investors tonight. It is a completely different world from what you are used to. I know it is hard for you to grasp, considering you spent your best years knocking on doors in bad neighborhoods to collect rent money in cash. We just did not want you to feel out of place among these people." Desmond winced. "Mom, please just let us finish this dinner and I will come straight to your house afterward. I promise." I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a scene in the traditional sense at all. I just looked at Vivian with a polite, razor-sharp smile. "You are absolutely right, Vivian. I did spend the 1980s knocking on doors collecting rent in cash. I dealt with broken heaters, evictions, and bankers who refused to look a black woman in the eye. I built my foundation on concrete and sweat. And because I did that, I actually know how to read a financial statement. Which brings me to this lovely celebration tonight." I turned my attention back to my son. "Desmond, how exactly are you paying for this top-tier luxury networking event right now?" Desmond swallowed hard. He looked around the room nervously. "Mom, please not here. I am putting it on my personal card. We can talk about this later." I reached into my handbag and pulled out my phone. "Are you sure about that, Desmond?" "Because my accounting department alerted me this afternoon about an unusual reservation deposit. You see, when you are the vice president of finance for Vance Properties, you get a corporate expense card. That card is strictly for building maintenance, contractor supplies, and commercial tenant emergencies. It is not a magical fund for your wife and her mother. It is not a fund to eat imported lobster on my birthday." Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "You are being ridiculous. Desmond is a vice president. He has executive privileges. A dinner is a standard business write-off. You are just trying to humiliate us because you feel left out." I did not look at Chloe. I kept my eyes locked on Desmond. Desmond knew the truth. He knew he was drowning in debt. He knew he had maxed out every single personal credit line he had to fund Chloe and her absolutely ridiculous lifestyle over the past year. I was using my company money to keep his mother-in-law in pearls and his wife in designer clothes. I flagged down the waiter who had been hovering nervously near the service station. "Excuse me, young man," I called out clearly. The waiter hurried over, looking between me and Desmond. "Yes, madam. Is there an issue with the table?" "No issue at all with the service," I said smoothly. "But I believe the gentleman sitting here handed you a black corporate card to keep on file for this table. Is that correct?" The waiter nodded slowly, answering, "Yes, madam." He opened a tab with it when they arrived. "Excellent," I replied. I unlocked my phone and opened my secure banking application. I held the screen up so Desmond, Chloe, and Vivian could all clearly see the Vance Properties corporate account dashboard. I pressed my finger against the screen. The button glowed red. The account status instantly changed from active to frozen. "I am the owner of that corporate account," I told the waiter, "and I just reported that specific card stolen. Any charges attempted on it will be immediately declined for fraud. You should probably ask this gentleman today. You should ask him for another form of payment before you bring them their main courses." The color completely vanished from the room, and Vivian dropped her wineglass onto the table, the expensive liquid spilling across the white linen cloth. "Wait, you cannot do that," Chloe shrieked, forgetting all about her high society manners. "Our bill is already over $1,500. Desmond patted his pockets frantically, pulling out his personal leather wallet. He stared at his own credit cards, knowing full well every single one of them would decline. "Mom, reverse that right now. You are embarrassing me." The drive back to my estate in Buckhead took exactly 22 minutes. I did not speed down the highway. I did not grip the steering wheel in a fit of rage. Anger is a foolish emotion reserved for people who do not have a solid plan. I spent the quiet drive listening to the smooth hum of my luxury sedan engine and thinking about the concrete foundation of my business. Commercial real estate teaches you hard lessons about human nature. You learn very quickly that greedy people will smile warmly in your face while plotting to completely steal the ground right out from under your feet. When I pulled up to my private gates, the security camera recognized my license plate, and the heavy wrought iron swung open silently. I drove up the long, sweeping driveway flanked by massive oak trees. Immediately, I noticed a vehicle parked carelessly near my front steps, crushing a patch of my prized landscaping. It was Desmond's luxury sedan. The front passenger door was slightly ajar, meaning they had arrived in a frantic, sloppy rush. I parked my car and took a deep breath. I knew exactly what trap was waiting inside my majestic home. They had fled the steakhouse, abandoning Vivian to wash dishes. I unlocked my custom mahogany front door and stepped into the grand foyer. My heels clicked rhythmically against the imported marble floor, echoing through the massive space. The house was usually perfectly quiet at this hour, but tonight I heard hushed, panicked voices coming from my formal living room. I walked down the long hallway, taking my absolute time. I paused at the arched doorway and surveyed the pathetic scene unfolding before me. Desmond was pacing back and forth across my Persian rug, tugging frantically at his expensive designer silk tie like it was choking him. Chloe was sitting on the edge of my white leather sofa, her overpriced designer purse clutched tightly in her lap. Her leg was bouncing up and down with nervous energy. Sitting in the velvet armchair directly across from her was a man I had never seen before. He wore a cheap gray suit that fit him poorly, and his narrow face was shiny with sweat. He clutched a battered leather briefcase against his chest, looking like a cornered rat. They had set up an ambush in my home. Desmond stopped pacing the very second he saw me standing in the doorway. He let out a loud, exasperated groan and threw his hands up in the air. "Mom, what is wrong with you?" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with panic. "How could you do something so vindictive to us? You completely humiliated my wife in front of the entire restaurant. Do you have any idea what you just caused tonight? I had to leave Vivian there as collateral while I rushed back here to figure out this massive financial mess. The restaurant manager threatened to call the police on her. Vivian was genuinely crying, Mom, actually crying. You left an elderly woman alone to face a grand theft charge because you threw a tantrum over a corporate card." I walked fully into the room and took my usual seat in the high-backed wing chair at the head of the arrangement. I smoothed my skirt and looked directly at my son. "I did not throw a tantrum, Desmond," I replied calmly. "I stopped a financial crime in progress." You committed corporate fraud. You stole company funds to feed your massive, fragile ego. Vivian is a grown adult who loves to boast about possessing her immense wealth so she can figure out how to cover her own tab. Chloe stood up abruptly, dropping the sweet, innocent daughter-in-law act completely. The syrupy tone she used at the restaurant vanished entirely, replaced by a harsh, venomous sneer. "Do not speak about my mother that way," Chloe snapped, stepping aggressively toward me. "You have been looking down on us for years, Beatrice. You sit in this massive mansion hoarding millions of dollars in commercial properties while your own flesh and blood struggles to survive. You think you are so superior because you built some incredibly concrete buildings in the city, but you are really just a bitter, lonely old woman who refuses to help her own family." Desmond stepped up beside his wife, nodding in furious agreement. "We tried to do this the nice way, Mom. We tried to include you in our lives, but you are totally out of control. Your behavior tonight proves it. You are erratic. You are making rash decisions, locking accounts, and threatening my career. We cannot let you destroy the family legacy because your mind is slipping away from you." The sweaty man in the cheap gray suit finally stood up. He fumbled with the metal latch on his briefcase, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice reedy and thin, "my name is Robert Pendleton. I am legal counsel for your son and your daughter-in-law." I looked the man up and down, noting the frayed cuffs of his dress shirt and the scuffed toes of his cheap shoes. Desmond had obviously hired the absolute most desperate attorney he could find in the city. Mr. Pendleton stepped forward hesitantly and dropped the heavy, imposing physical stack of papers onto my glass coffee table. The title on the front page was printed in bold black letters. It read Medical and Financial Conservatorship Petition. Chloe leaned over the table, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernail against the thick document. "We are giving you a choice tonight, Beatrice," she said, her voice dropping to a cold, calculated whisper. "You are going to sign this legal document right now. You are going to grant Desmond full, immediate legal control over all of your commercial real estate properties, your bank accounts, and your business operations. If you sign it, we absolutely will let you live out the rest of your days quietly in this house. You will have a small allowance. You will be reasonably comfortable." I stared at the imposing stack of papers, and then I slowly looked up at my son. "You want to legally strip me of my human rights?" I asked, my tone completely flat and devoid of emotion. Desmond crossed his arms tightly, looking away from me, unable to meet my eyes. "It is for your own good, Mom. You are 70 years old. You are clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline, and we truly urgently need to step in before you ruin everything." Chloe smiled a cruel, triumphant smile. "And if you refuse to sign it, Beatrice, we will go to a judge tomorrow morning. Robert here has already drafted an emergency petition for the court. We have a medical doctor lined up who owes Desmond a huge financial favor. He is perfectly willing to testify under oath that you are suffering from advanced, rapid-onset dementia. We will tell the court all about your erratic, unhinged behavior tonight at the steakhouse. We will tell them you are a massive danger to yourself and your multi-million-dollar business. The judge will grant us emergency conservatorship immediately." I felt a cold, hard knot form deep in my chest. They were not just trying to steal my money anymore. They were actively threatening to erase my entire humanity. Chloe leaned closer, her face mere inches from mine. "If you make us take you to court, Beatrice, we will not let you stay in this beautiful mansion. Once Desmond has legal control, we will sell this house to the highest bidder. We will pack up your things in garbage bags and strip you of your legal rights." The room held its breath after Chloe finished describing the life she planned to leave me, with a sold mansion, a controlled allowance, and a legal record declaring me incapable of managing the company I had built. Desmond kept his arms folded, but his eyes would not stay on mine. Robert Pendleton hovered beside the coffee table, with the conservatorship petition spread open like a trap. I was about to answer when the front door opened behind them. A moment later, Jamal stepped into the foyer with his backpack over one shoulder and his laptop case in his hand. He stopped when he saw the strangers in my living room, then looked at the papers on the table, at his father, and finally at me. Desmond turned sharply. "Jamal, this is family business," he said. "Go upstairs." Jamal set his backpack beside the doorway instead. "I am family," he replied. Jamal ignored her. He walked to the coffee table, opened his laptop case, and removed a thick stack of printed statements marked with red tabs. He placed them directly on top of the conservatorship petition. Desmond stared at the pages. I watched the muscles tighten along his jaw. Jamal had spent the previous semester helping me review expense reports through a restricted intern account I had created for him. He was a senior finance major, and I wanted him to learn that numbers were not decoration. Numbers were testimony. If you followed them patiently enough, they told you who was lying. Jamal opened the first statement and pointed to a series of transfers. 3 weeks earlier, he had noticed several tenant security deposits leaving escrow accounts before any lease obligations required them to move. At first, he assumed the entries were posting errors. Then he found another transfer and another, each authorized through Desmond's vice president credentials. He traced the destination accounts until the pattern became impossible to dismiss. $300,000 had been removed from protected tenant funds in increments designed to look like routine operating expenses. The money did not go to contractors' repairs insurance or taxes. It went into the operating account of Chloe's Elegance LLC, the luxury boutique that Chloe had spent 3 years insisting was one season away from becoming profitable. Jamal turned another page toward me. Every transfer was listed by date, amount, originating account, destination account, and authorization code. There was no guesswork left. Desmond tried to seize the papers, but Jamal placed his hand over them. "Do not touch these, Dad," he said. "I already made digital copies." Desmond's face darkened. "You went through my accounts," he demanded. Jamal corrected him without raising his voice. "I reviewed company accounts using the auditing credentials Grandma gave me. Those accounts belong to Vance Properties. The tenant deposits belong to the tenants. None of that money belongs to you." Chloe stepped forward and accused Jamal of misunderstanding executive finance. She claimed Desmond had merely moved cash temporarily to support a related family business. Jamal shook his head. Chloe's Elegance was not a subsidiary, not a vendor, and not an approved investment. There were no board resolutions, no loan documents, and no repayment schedule. The transfers had also been coded under false maintenance categories. He had checked the corresponding invoices. They did not exist. I looked at Desmond. Until that moment, he had tried to frame my frozen corporate card as evidence that I was becoming unstable. Now the same man stood in my house confronted with a paper trail showing that he had been draining money entrusted to us by tenants. I asked him one simple question. How long? He did not answer. Jamal answered for him. The oldest suspicious transfer he had confirmed was 7 months old. The amounts began small, then increased as Chloe's boutique losses grew. Jamal had found emails showing Desmond telling himself the withdrawals were temporary advances, yet there was no evidence that a single dollar had ever been returned. Desmond finally snapped that he had planned to replace everything once Chloe's holiday collection succeeded. I told him gambling with stolen money was still theft, even when the thief expected to win later. Robert Pendleton began edging away from the table. He asked whether the documents had been obtained legally. Jamal turned toward him and explained the account permissions, the audit log, and the read-only credentials attached to his university internship. Every action was time-stamped. He had not hacked anything. He had simply looked where Desmond assumed no one young enough to be dismissed and careful enough to notice would look. That explanation seemed to frighten the lawyer more than any accusation I had made. Pendleton picked up the conservatorship petition as if suddenly worried that his fingerprints might become part of something larger. Chloe told him to put it back down. He obeyed her, but his hand trembled. Desmond's embarrassment turned to fury. He stepped toward Jamal and accused him of betraying his own father. Jamal remained still. He said loyalty did not mean helping families steal from other people. Desmond told him he was an ungrateful child who had no idea what pressure came with maintaining a company, a marriage, and a public reputation. Jamal replied that pressure did not create authorization codes or false invoices. Choices did. That sentence broke whatever restraint Desmond had left. He lunged across the coffee table, grabbed Jamal by the collar, and jerked him forward. Chloe shouted at Jamal to apologize. Pendleton backed toward the wall. Jamal did not strike his father. He locked both hands around Desmond's wrists and held his ground. I brought the tip of my cane down against the hardwood floor with a crack that stopped every voice in the room. "Let him go," I said. Desmond froze. I struck the floor once more, not because he had failed to hear me, but because I wanted him to understand that my patience had ended. I told him he was holding the only person in that room who still understood what family loyalty actually required. Jamal had protected tenants. He had never met a grandmother he respected and a company he might never inherit. Desmond had protected a lifestyle. There was a difference, and everyone in the room could see it. Slowly, Desmond released his son's collar. Jamal straightened his sweater and stepped beside my chair. He did not look shaken. He looked disappointed. Then Jamal lifted one final page from the stack. The summary showed the total in bold $300,000. I asked Desmond whether he still wanted to tell a judge that I was the person incapable of managing money. His breathing became heavy and uneven. His face flushed as he looked from the evidence to the conservatorship papers beneath it. For the first time that evening, the accusation of dementia sounded exactly as desperate as it was. Jamal closed the folder and told his father that the records were only the beginning. He had found unusual references to a much larger obligation in Desmond's private expense notes, but the entries were incomplete. Before Jamal could explain further, Chloe looked at the $300,000 total and did something none of us expected. She laughed. Desmond was still breathing heavily, his face flushed with the embarrassment of being exposed by his own son. But Chloe did not look embarrassed. She did not look scared. Instead, she threw her head back and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound bounced off the high ceilings of my living room, cold and entirely out of place. She slowly stood up from the white leather sofa and smoothed the front of her expensive dress. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Jamal," she said, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You think you just saved the day with your little computer tricks. $300,000. She waved her hand dismissively, as if the staggering amount of stolen money was nothing more than pocket change. "Desmond," she snapped, turning to her husband, "stop sweating and stand up straight. Let the boy have his moment. It does not matter anyway." Desmond looked at his wife in total confusion, but he slowly lowered his hands. Jamal stood his ground next to me, his jaw set tightly. "What do you mean it does not matter?" Jamal demanded. "I have the wire transfer logs. I can prove you committed felony embezzlement." Chloe took a slow, deliberate step toward the coffee table, where the conservatorship document still sat. She placed both of her hands flat on the glass surface and leaned forward, looking directly into my eyes. "Because, Beatrice," she said softly, her tone completely devoid of any human empathy, "that $300,000 was just a drop in the bucket. We burned through that money months ago to keep my boutique afloat. But the boutique kept sinking, and Desmond's massive debts kept piling up. We needed a real solution. We needed major capital. I kept my posture rigid, refusing to let her see any trace of surprise. "What exactly did you do, Chloe?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. She smiled, revealing perfectly whitened teeth. "Well," she began, pacing slowly around the edge of the coffee table. "You see, Beatrice, about 8 months ago when you were dealing with that severe bout of pneumonia, Desmond convinced you to sign a series of standard contingency documents. You thought you were just authorizing him to handle routine vendor payments while you recovered in the hospital. But my brilliant husband slipped in a secondary authorization form. I did not move a single muscle, but my mind began racing back to that hospital stay. I remembered Desmond bringing me a stack of mundane paperwork to keep the property management company running smoothly. He made me an emergency co-signer on your master corporate portfolio," Chloe revealed triumphantly. "He granted me temporary executive execution rights under the guise of an emergency corporate structure. It was completely buried in the fine print. You never even noticed it." Jamal tensed beside me. "You committed forgery and fraud," he stated flatly. Chloe rolled her eyes. "We utilized a legal loophole, Jamal. Grow up. The business world is not a morality contest." She turned her attention back to me. "Once I had that authorization, I went shopping, Beatrice. I needed to save my business, and Desmond needed to pay off some very aggressive personal creditors. So I took the deed to your flagship commercial property. I took the paperwork for your massive Midtown building. The Midtown building was the crown jewel of my entire real estate portfolio. It was a sprawling 12-story commercial complex filled with local minority-owned businesses, medical offices, and community centers. I had spent 2 decades acquiring and developing that specific property. You tried to mortgage the Midtown building," I stated, maintaining my perfectly flat vocal tone. "No traditional bank would ever approve a commercial loan of that magnitude without conducting a rigorous in-person verification process with the primary owner." Chloe laughed again, a harsh, grating sound. "You are absolutely right, Beatrice. A traditional bank would never approve it. The corporate underwriters asked way too many questions. They wanted physical meetings and notarized verifications. So we did not go to a traditional bank. We went to a private investment group. The shady lawyer in the cheap suit, Robert Pendleton, suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clutching his battered briefcase even tighter against his chest. "It is a specialized capital lending firm," Pendleton muttered nervously, wiping a bead of sweat from his upper lip. "They provide high-risk, high-yield liquidity loans without the standard regulatory oversight." I looked at the pathetic lawyer and then back at my daughter-in-law. "You went to loan sharks," I concluded. "You bypassed the banking system and handed over the corporate deed of my most valuable property to an organized crime syndicate." Desmond finally spoke up, his voice trembling. "We had absolutely no choice, Mom. The creditors were threatening to take everything. They were threatening to come to our house. The private lenders gave us $2 million in cash up front. We were going to invest it, flip the profits, and pay the loan back before you ever found out. It was a foolproof plan." I stared at my son, marveling at his absolute towering stupidity. "You took a $2 million illegal street loan using my commercial skyscraper as collateral," I said, making sure to articulate every single word clearly. "And you gave the money to Chloe to fix her failing fashion boutique." Chloe slammed her hand against the coffee table, her fake composure finally cracking. "The boutique is just going through a transitional phase," she yelled angrily. "But the private lenders are not patient people, Beatrice. They do not care about transitional phases or retail slumps. They only care about their repayment schedule." She took a deep breath, smoothing her hair and forcing her cruel smile back into place. "And their repayment schedule is incredibly aggressive. The first massive installment of $500,000 is due tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. We do not have the money, Beatrice. It is completely gone." I sat quietly in my wing chair, letting the sheer magnitude of their colossal failure fill the room. "And what exactly happens at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning when you default on a mob loan?" I asked. Desmond swallowed hard, looking genuinely terrified. "They seize the collateral, Mom. They bypass the standard foreclosure laws entirely. They will send their people to the Midtown building tomorrow morning. They will physically lock out every single one of your commercial tenants. They will seize the property, liquidate the assets, and destroy your entire legacy before lunchtime. They made it very clear that they will hurt us if we try to stop them." Chloe tapped the conservatorship petition sitting on the glass table. "Which brings us back to this beautiful legal document, Beatrice. If you sign this conservatorship right now, you give Desmond total legal authority over your entire portfolio. We can immediately liquidate your 2 smaller warehouse properties in the industrial district. We can use the cash to pay off the private lenders tomorrow morning and save your precious Midtown building." She leaned over, picking up a sleek metal pen from her purse and placing it directly on top of the petition. "If you refuse to sign this, Beatrice, you will lose your flagship building tomorrow. Your tenants will be thrown out onto the street. Your reputation in Atlanta will be completely ruined. The private lenders will seize the property, and they will come after you for the remaining balance. But if you sign it, we will handle the debt. We will take control of the company, and we will allow you to retire peacefully in this house. You have absolutely no other options left. You are backed into a corner and the clock is ticking." Jamal looked down at me, his eyes wide with genuine concern. He had hacked the bank accounts and found the embezzlement, but he had absolutely no idea they had leveraged a multi-million-dollar property to organized criminals. The threat of physical violence was now hanging heavily in the air. The lawyer, Robert Pendleton, took a hesitant step forward. "Mrs. Vance, I strongly advise you to sign the petition tonight. These specific private lenders are incredibly dangerous individuals. They operate outside the bounds of the law. If they seize the building tomorrow, the fallout will be catastrophic for your business and your personal safety." Desmond fell to his knees on the Persian rug, looking up at me with tears streaming down his face. "Mom, please just sign the paper. We can fix this. We can sell the smaller buildings and make this entire nightmare go away. I promise I will manage the company perfectly from now on. Just sign the document so they do not kill us." The room fell entirely silent. The ticking of my grandfather clock echoed through the grand foyer. They had played their absolute best card. They had cornered me with illegal debt, violent loan sharks, and total ruin. I looked at the thick stack of papers sitting on my glass coffee table. Desmond was still kneeling on the Persian rug, pleading with his eyes. Chloe was standing tall, her arms crossed, waiting for my inevitable surrender. Robert Pendleton, the sweaty lawyer, was holding his breath. They genuinely believed they had won. They truly thought that the threat of violent criminals and public ruin would finally force me to break. But I did not panic. I did not scream or cry or beg them for mercy. Instead, I slowly walked over to my custom leather armchair and sat down. I arranged my skirt perfectly. I placed my hands on the armrests and got completely comfortable. I looked at the three of them with absolute total serenity. Desmond looked confused by my reaction. He had expected me to collapse into tears. Chloe frowned, her triumphant smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. She did not understand why I was not begging for my life. You see, my son and his wife had made a massive, fundamental miscalculation tonight. They thought they were dealing with a frightened, fragile 70-year-old woman. They completely forgot who they were talking to. They forgot that in the 1980s I had to deal with ruthless property developers, corrupt city officials, and aggressive bankers who wanted to see a young black woman fail. I had faced down men infinitely more dangerous and infinitely smarter than the absolute fools standing in my living room tonight. The threat of street-level thugs did not terrify me. It merely bored me. I turned my gaze entirely to my daughter-in-law. Chloe. I began, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of any fear. You have always possessed a very specific kind of arrogance. It is the exact same kind of empty, unearned arrogance your mother Vivian displays so proudly. You both come from a family that places all of its value on the illusion of wealth rather than the actual foundation of it. You know how to spend money perfectly. You know how to buy imported designer dresses and lease luxury vehicles to impress people you do not even like. You know how to order the most expensive champagne at a Buckhead steakhouse. But you do not have the absolute slightest idea how to actually build wealth. You do not understand how money functions when it is put to work. You only understand how to watch it burn. You view my hard-earned assets as your personal piggy bank, a magical resource that exists solely to bail you out of your endless string of pathetic failures. You assume that because I am 70 years old, I must be slow, oblivious, and easy to manipulate. That is your ultimate fatal flaw, Chloe. You mistook my quiet observation for ignorance. Chloe narrowed her eyes, her face flushing a deep, angry red. I know how to secure a $2 million loan, she snapped back, her voice defensive and sharp. I know how to leverage assets, Beatrice. You are just upset because I outsmarted you. I used your own massive empire to fund my lifestyle, and you did not even notice until it was too late. We hold the ultimate leverage now. We hold your legacy in our hands. If you do not sign that paper, your beloved tenants will be physically thrown onto the curb tomorrow morning. You will be universally disgraced. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound shocked Desmond so badly he actually flinched. You did not outsmart anyone, Chloe. I corrected her gently, as if speaking to a slow child. You merely stumbled blindly into a very basic trap because you lack fundamental real estate knowledge. When you build commercial properties from the ground up, you learn that the paperwork is the only thing that matters. You learn that a deed is not just a piece of paper. It is a legally binding anchor that determines the entire reality of a transaction. If you actually knew anything about commercial lending, you would have conducted a basic title check before you ever approached those violent loan sharks. You would have done your proper due diligence. You would have hired a competent attorney instead of this terrified amateur standing in my living room right now. But you did not do that. You just saw the name on the corporate master portfolio and assumed you held the ultimate winning hand. You acted on pure reckless greed. Chloe glared at me, stepping away from the coffee table. I did check the paperwork, she spat defensively. I am not an idiot, Beatrice. I had Robert look over everything before we went to the private lenders. He verified the asset portfolio. He confirmed the corporate structure. I know exactly what I pledged as collateral to those men. The deed clearly explicitly states that the massive Midtown commercial complex belongs entirely to Vance Properties. It is part of the corporate trust. Desmond nodded eagerly from his spot on the floor, confirming her statement. It does, Mom. We saw the master deed list. You put the Midtown building under the primary Vance Properties holding company 5 years ago. It is legally yours, which means it was legally available to be leveraged by the emergency co-signer. We did everything by the book to secure the cash. We followed your corporate structure perfectly. You cannot bluff your way out of this reality. You have to sign the conservatorship, or we are all going to suffer the terrible consequences. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that finally made the cheap lawyer Robert Pendleton take a nervous step backward toward the front door. You saw an outdated master list, Desmond. I explained, my tone entirely conversational. You saw what I allowed you to see. 6 months ago, when I first noticed the glaring irregularities in your accounting reports, I realized you were quietly stealing tenant security deposits. I knew you were desperate. I knew you were weak. And I knew you would eventually try to make a massive, catastrophic move to cover your failing tracks. so I took immediate legal precautions. I did not sit around waiting to be robbed by my own family. I moved strategically and silently to protect my legacy from your reckless incompetence. I looked past my son and focused my absolute attention on my grandson, who was standing quietly by the doorway. Jamal had been watching the entire exchange with a look of absolute disgust directed squarely at his father. He understood exactly what I was doing. He understood the trap that had been waiting for them all along. "Jamal," I called out, keeping my voice perfectly steady, "please open your laptop right now, log into the County Public Records database, pull up the current updated property deed for the Midtown Commercial Complex. Do a live search right now in front of everyone. Show your father and your stepmother exactly what they used to secure a $2 million illegal street loan. Show them the absolute reality of their massive monumental mistake." Jamal nodded, his face completely unreadable. He quickly opened his laptop, balancing it carefully on one hand, while his other hand typed furiously across the keyboard. The silence in the room became incredibly thick and suffocating. Desmond slowly stood up from the floor, his eyes darting frantically between me and his son. Chloe crossed her arms tightly, trying desperately to maintain her confident facade, but her breathing had become noticeably shallow. The lawyer, Robert Pendleton, was sweating profusely now, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of Jamal's computer. They were all finally beginning to realize that they had walked directly into a buzzsaw. They waited in absolute terror for my final devastating crushing blow. Jamal's fingers moved across the keyboard while the county records portal loaded. Nobody spoke. Even Chloe, who had spent the last hour filling my living room with threats, seemed unwilling to interrupt the slow appearance of the public record. Jamal entered the parcel number for the Midtown Commercial Complex, verified the address, and opened the most recent deed image. He turned the laptop so the screen faced Desmond, Chloe, and Robert Pendleton. At first, Desmond looked relieved. He recognized the property description, the square footage, and the familiar Vance name in the transfer history. Then Jamal scrolled to the current owner line. The relief disappeared from my son's face. The deed did not list Vance Properties. It listed the Georgia Civil Rights Historical Trust. Chloe leaned closer as if proximity could change the words. She demanded that Jamal refresh the page. He did. The same record returned. She accused him of manipulating the website, so he opened a second county mirror, then the state property database. Every source showed the same thing. 6 months earlier, title to the Midtown complex had been legally transferred out of Vance Properties and donated to the Georgia Civil Rights Historical Trust. The transfer had been recorded, notarized, accepted, and indexed before Chloe ever approached her private lenders. There was no hidden technicality. There was no pending paperwork. The building they believed they had mortgaged was no longer mine to pledge, no longer Desmond's to touch, and certainly never Chloe's to use as collateral. Desmond stared at me. 6 months ago, he asked. I told him yes. 6 months earlier, I had begun seeing irregularities in the accounting reports under his supervision. Tenant deposits were taking too long to reconcile. Vendor categories were being used in ways that did not match the underlying invoices. Nothing was large enough by itself to justify a public accusation, but I had spent 40 years learning that major fraud rarely announces itself with a trumpet. It begins with small inconsistencies that people hope you are too busy, too trusting, or too old to investigate. I was not ready to accuse my son then. I was ready to protect the asset, most likely to tempt him if his problems grew worse. The Midtown building mattered to me for reasons beyond its market value. It housed medical offices, neighborhood organizations, minority-owned businesses, and community programs that had survived because the rents were stable and the property was insulated from speculative pressure. I had already been discussing a donation structure with the Georgia Civil Rights Historical Trust. When Desmond's accounting began to trouble me, I completed that plan. The trust accepted the property with restrictions designed to preserve its historic and community function. The public deed was recorded immediately. I left the outdated master portfolio schedule inside the internal files because I wanted to see whether anyone desperate enough to misuse my authority would rely on an old corporate list instead of performing a proper title search. Chloe's face changed as she understood what I was saying. She had not discovered a clever shortcut. She had taken an obsolete document, combined it with authority Desmond had slipped to her while I was sick, and presented the result as proof that she could encumber a building she did not own. I told her that the forged package she delivered to the private lenders was worse than ordinary mortgage fraud. The property was held by a public interest historical trust operating under state and federal protections. By manufacturing papers that falsely represented control over that asset, and then using those papers to obtain $2 million across financial channels, she had created a trail that would interest far more than a local civil court. Robert Pendleton made a faint choking sound. Until then, he had been sweating because his clients were reckless. Now he looked as though he had suddenly realized that his own name might be attached to evidence. He asked Jamal to enlarge the recording stamp on the deed. Jamal did. Pendleton studied the date, then the transfer instrument, then the public filing number. He asked to see the trust acceptance page. Jamal opened it. The lawyer's face went gray. He whispered that the document package Chloe had shown the lenders could not possibly have been genuine if it represented Vance Properties as the present title holder. Chloe snapped that Robert had reviewed the package himself. Pendleton immediately denied preparing the deed. He said he had only reviewed copies supplied by Desmond and Chloe. I reminded him that less than an hour earlier, he had placed a conservatorship petition on my coffee table and threatened to help declare me incompetent using a doctor who allegedly owed Desmond a favor. Pendleton looked at the papers as if they had caught fire. He began gathering them into his briefcase. Chloe ordered him to stop. She insisted that the trust transfer could be challenged, reversed, delayed, anything. I told her the transfer had already been completed months before, and that the trust had no obligation to surrender the building merely because she had lied to dangerous people about owning it. The Midtown tenants were not going to be locked out at 9 in the morning. The collateral her lenders thought they possessed did not exist. That was when Desmond finally understood the direction of the danger. He had spent the evening warning me that violent lenders would seize my property if I refused to sign, but they could not seize what he and Chloe had never owned. Their $2 million had been advanced against forged collateral. When the payment failed, those men would not be coming after the Georgia Civil Rights Historical Trust. They would be coming after the people who had taken their money. Desmond sank onto the edge of the sofa. Chloe stopped talking. For the first time since I entered the house, genuine fear replaced arrogance in her eyes. I watched each of them absorb the same fact. Desmond saw the collapse of the rescue plan he had promised himself would save his career. Chloe saw the disappearance of the leverage she had used to threaten me. Pendleton saw criminal exposure. Jamal saw confirmation that careful records could defeat intimidation without a raised voice. I saw something simpler. 6 months of patience had done what panic never could. I had protected the building before the thieves knew they wanted it, and now their shortcuts had converted a family betrayal into evidence they could not explain away. Pendleton closed his briefcase so quickly that one corner of the conservatorship petition remained sticking out. He shoved it inside, snapped both latches, and backed toward the foyer. Chloe demanded that he stay and fix the situation. He told her there was nothing he could fix in my living room. He muttered that he needed independent counsel and that he had never agreed to participate in forged mortgage documents. Then he looked at me and tried to say that the conservatorship matter had been preliminary. I told him to save that explanation for whoever asked him under oath. He did not answer. He hurried through the foyer, yanked open the heavy oak front door, and ran. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind the fleeing lawyer, leaving a deafening silence in my grand living room. The echo of Robert Pendleton running for his life broke the spell of shock holding my son and his wife hostage. Chloe let out a sharp, ragged gasp as the true gravity of her situation crashed down upon her shoulders. She was no longer a wealthy boutique owner playing a high-stakes game of corporate monopoly. She was a fraudster who had stolen $2 million from organized criminals using federal property as collateral. The loan sharks were coming. They were not going to show up at my Midtown building tomorrow morning with a standard eviction notice. They were going to show up at her house with weapons. Desmond realized it at the exact same moment. The last shred of his arrogant corporate pride evaporated completely. My 45-year-old son, a vice president of finance who wore tailored suits and drove imported luxury cars, physically collapsed. His knees hit the expensive Persian rug with a dull, sickening thud. He crawled forward, closing the distance between us, until he was kneeling directly at my feet. The slick, confident man who had strutted into an upscale steakhouse just 2 hours ago to celebrate stealing my money was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified little boy begging his mother to fix a monumental mess he had made. "Mom, you have to help us." Desmond pleaded, his voice cracking as tears spilled hot and fast down his cheeks. You have massive cash reserves. I know you do. You have millions sitting in your private emergency accounts. You have to wire us the money right now. We can pay the private lenders back tonight immediately. We can give them their $2 million back with a massive interest penalty, and they will leave us alone. Then we can hire a real defense team to deal with the federal government before they notice the public records. Please, Mom, I am begging you. You cannot let them kill me. Chloe dropped to her knees right beside him, her designer dress bunching up awkwardly on the floor. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone, and her mascara was beginning to run down her face in dark streaks. Beatrice, she sobbed, her voice incredibly high and frantic. He is your only son. You cannot just sit there and watch us die. You have the liquidity to make this entirely go away. We will sign whatever you want. We will give you the boutique. We will move out of Atlanta. Just write the check and save our lives. I will never ask you for another dime as long as I live. Please, Beatrice. We made a terrible mistake, but we are still your family. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, looking down at the two of them. I felt a profound sense of sorrow inside. I felt a deep sorrow in my soul, but it was not because they were in danger. I felt sorrow because I realized I was looking at two people who had absolutely zero moral compass. They were not apologizing for stealing $300,000 from my hardworking commercial tenants. They were not apologizing for trying to strip away my human rights with a fraudulent medical conservatorship. They were not apologizing for treating me like a senile burden. They were only crying because they had been caught, and the people they had crossed were extremely dangerous, violent men. Desmond reached out and grabbed the hem of my skirt, his hands shaking violently. "Mom, think about our legacy," he cried out desperately. "Think about everything you and Dad built. If I go down for this, our family name is going to be dragged through the mud. The Atlanta business community will turn their backs on us. The media will have an absolute field day with the Vance family scandal. You built this empire to pass down to me. You cannot let your own flesh and blood get slaughtered over $2 million. It is just pocket change." I looked at my son, and I felt the last lingering thread of maternal obligation snap and dissolve into dust. He dared to speak to me about our legacy. He dared to weaponize the empire I had built with my late husband. We had started with nothing but a small loan and a relentless work ethic, fighting against redlining and systemic banking discrimination to buy our first rundown property. We had worked 18-hour days to ensure Desmond never had to know what true poverty tasted like, and he had taken that privilege and completely weaponized it entirely. He had turned himself into a greedy parasite who viewed my life savings as his personal slush fund. I gently but firmly pulled my skirt out of his grasping hands. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the blistering rage burning inside my chest. I simply turned my attention away from the pathetic adults crying on my floor and looked across the room at my grandson. Jamal was still standing perfectly straight, holding his laptop. I had not moved a single inch during his father's humiliating breakdown. His jaw was clenched tight. His eyes were clear and completely focused. He was a 21-year-old college student who possessed more integrity, resilience, and business acumen than his father ever would. "Jamal," I said, my voice slicing through the sound of Chloe's frantic sobbing, "did you hit send?" Desmond froze his eyes, darting back and forth between me and his son. He stopped crying for a brief second, confusion momentarily overriding his absolute terror. "Hit send," Desmond whispered, wiping his face. "Hit send on what? What are you talking about?" Jamal looked directly at his father with cold, firm resolve. His expression was a mirror image of my own, cold, calculating, and resolute. "I hit send." Grandma Jamal confirmed, his voice steady and unwavering. The entire encrypted file transferred successfully. I sent the forged mortgage documents, the complete accounting logs of the embezzled tenant security deposits, and the undeniable digital proof of the wire fraud. It all went directly to the Cybercrime Division of the Atlanta Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I copied the State Attorney General and the local commercial fraud unit just to be absolutely certain it does not get buried or ignored completely. The air was sucked completely out of the grand living room. Chloe let out a blood-curdling shriek and buried her face in her hands, rocking back and forth on the rug. Desmond stared at his own son as if Jamal had just stabbed him in the chest. "You turned me in." Desmond gasped, his voice barely a hollow whisper. "You turned your own father over to the feds. You sent me to prison. You sent yourself to prison, Dad," Jamal replied, stepping away from the doorway and moving closer to my chair. You stole from this family ruthlessly. You tried to lock my grandmother away in a facility just so you could cover up your own massive failures. You threw away everything she built for us. You do not get to play the victim now." I gripped the carved wooden handles of my cane and slowly pushed myself up from my armchair. I stood at my full height, towering over the two kneeling figures on my floor. Outside in the cool night air, a faint sound began to pierce the quiet isolation of my sprawling estate. It was a high-pitched wail cutting through the darkness. The sound grew louder, multiplying into a chorus of frantic police sirens. "Desmond," I said, "real estate can be rebuilt, but loyalty cannot be." The wail of the police sirens grew exponentially louder, cutting through the peaceful silence of my Buckhead estate. The flashing red and blue lights began to dance across the sheer curtains of my formal living room, painting the faces of my treacherous son and his deceitful wife in harsh alternating colors. They stayed frozen on the Persian rug, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of their own actions. The heavy pounding on my custom mahogany front door echoed like a thunderclap. I did not move to open it. I simply nodded to Jamal, who walked with absolute composure down the hallway to unlock the deadbolt. A swarm of local Atlanta police officers and federal agents flooded into my grand foyer. Their heavy tactical boots stomped against my imported marble floors, but for once I did not mind the scuff marks. They were the sound of overdue justice. A tall, stern-looking federal agent in a dark windbreaker stepped directly into the living room. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the absolute pathetic sight of Desmond and Chloe still kneeling on the floor in their expensive tailored dinner clothes. Desmond Vance, the lead agent, announced, his voice booming with authority. "Chloe Vance, you are both under arrest for suspicion of wire fraud, embezzlement, and forging federal documents. Please stand up and keep your hands completely visible." Desmond could not stand. His legs simply refused to support his body weight. Two broad-shouldered officers had to physically haul him to his feet. He was openly sobbing now, his expensive silk tie hanging askew, his custom suit jacket wrinkling awkwardly as they twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists sounded incredibly final. "Mom," he cried out, twisting his neck to look back at me. "Mom, please tell them this is a huge misunderstanding. Tell them we were just managing the business accounts." Chloe did not beg. She chose a completely different route. As an officer grabbed her arms, she began thrashing wildly, her high heels slipping on the rug. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am a prominent business owner in this city. You cannot arrest me like a common street criminal. You are ruining my designer dress." The arresting officer did not even flinch. Uneasily subdued her, clamping the heavy steel cuffs around her wrists and reading her the Miranda rights in a bored, monotone voice. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited smoothly. "I highly suggest you start using it, ma'am." I remained seated in my leather armchair, watching the spectacular collapse of their manufactured high society lives. They had spent years turning up their noses at my blue-collar roots. They had mocked the way I built my fortune. Now they were being dragged out of my home in matching silver handcuffs, looking like the absolute lowest class of criminals. Just as the officers began marching the disgraced couple toward the front door, another vehicle pulled abruptly into my driveway. Through the large bay window, I watched a standard rideshare sedan come to a screeching halt directly behind the line of flashing police cruisers. The rear passenger door swung open, and Vivian stepped out onto the pavement. She was still wearing the same ridiculous pearl necklace from the steakhouse, but her elitist demeanor was now severely compromised by her furious, heavy breathing. She had clearly been forced to wait for a driver after the restaurant manager demanded she settle the massive bill. Vivian stomped up my front steps, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She pushed her way past a local police officer who was guarding the entrance, completely oblivious to the serious federal raid happening right in front of her face. "Beatrice," she screeched, stomping into my foyer. "How dare you leave me at that restaurant to deal with that humiliating disaster?" The manager threatened to call security on me. "I had to empty my entire checking account just to cover your son's champagne. You are an absolute monster." Her furious rant stopped abruptly as she finally registered the scene unfolding in my hallway. She saw Desmond being escorted toward a police cruiser by two federal agents. Then she saw her precious daughter Chloe being frog-marched out the door by a female officer. Chloe's expensive makeup was running down her cheeks, and she looked absolutely terrified. Vivian gasped, clutching her pearls with a dramatic theatrical flair. "Chloe, baby, what is happening here?" she yelled, trying to push past the officers. "Why are they treating you like a criminal?" Vivian turned her vicious glare directly toward me. Her eyes narrowed with pure venom. "You did this," she spat, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at my face. "You are a crazy, senile old woman making up vicious lies about your own family. I knew your mind was rotting away, Beatrice. You have completely lost your sanity, and now you are weaponizing the police to attack my innocent daughter. You belong in a locked psychiatric ward. You belong in a straitjacket." Vivian took another aggressive step forward, raising her hand as if she intended to physically strike me right there in my own home. I did not flinch. I did not need to defend myself because my grandson stepped smoothly into the space between us. Jamal positioned himself directly in front of Vivian, blocking her path completely. He simply radiated the exact same cold, calculating business energy that I had spent years teaching him. "Step away from my grandmother right now," Vivian Jamal commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, authoritative pitch. "You do not get to come into this house and disrespect the woman who built this entire empire. You do not get to call her crazy when your own daughter is a documented thief." Vivian scoffed, trying to look past him. "Move out of my way, you insolent little boy," she snapped. Jamal did not move. Instead, he turned his head and locked eyes with the lead federal agent standing nearby. "Excuse me," Agent Jamal said loudly, commanding the attention of the room. "My name is Jamal Vance. I am the internal auditor for Vance Properties, and I am the primary individual who transmitted the initial fraud report to your cybercrime division 45 minutes ago." The lead agent stepped forward, looking at my grandson with a high degree of professional respect. "You are the informant who provided the encrypted data logs?" the agent asked. Jamal nodded firmly. He reached over to the console table and picked up his high-powered digital tablet. "Yes, sir, I am. I have the entire secondary backup file right here on this encrypted device." He handed the sleek tablet directly to the federal agent. "This device contains the exact detailed Internet protocol addresses associated with Chloe's personal computer. It definitively proves that she logged into the corporate banking portal from her home network to execute the fraudulent wire transfers. It also contains the unedited digital communication logs between my father and the private lending firm operating out of the warehouse district. It provides the exact timeline of when they conspired to forge the mortgage deeds using federal historical property as their illegal collateral." The federal agent took the tablet, tapping the screen a few times to verify the data folders. He looked highly impressed. "This is incredibly thorough work, son," he praised. "This provides an ironclad digital trail. We have everything we need to secure a federal indictment by tomorrow morning." Jamal turned his attention back to Vivian, who was now staring at the digital tablet with her mouth hanging wide open. Her entire narrative about my supposed dementia had just been entirely dismantled by cold, hard, undeniable forensic evidence tonight. The next morning I was in my corporate office before sunrise. Sleep would have been useless, and there was too much work to do. Arresting Desmond and Chloe did not automatically repair the systems they had compromised. By 6:30, Jamal and I were seated at the long conference table with every access list, vendor authorization, banking permission, and property management account spread across 2 secure monitors. We started with Desmond. His executive credentials were revoked from the accounting platform, payroll system, banking portal, tenant, escrow records, building access network, and document server. Jamal changed the administrative recovery keys, while I contacted the institutions that held our operating accounts. Every instruction was documented. Every change required dual approval. I had spent my career teaching employees that a company survives on procedure, not personality, and that morning I followed my own rule. Next, we reviewed the accounts Chloe had touched through the emergency authority. Desmond had slipped into my hospital paperwork. Her permissions were terminated. Any pending transfer connected to her boutique was frozen for investigation. Jamal created a clean list of transactions that required forensic review and separated them from legitimate property expenses, so ordinary operations would not be disrupted. I refused to punish tenants' maintenance crews or vendors for crimes they did not commit. By 8 o'clock, our buildings were functioning normally again. The only people locked out were the 2 who had tried to steal control of them. Then I dictated a notice to every commercial tenant in the portfolio. I did not describe the family scandal or repeat rumors. I told them that Vance Properties had identified unauthorized financial activity by a former executive, that the relevant access had been terminated, that tenant deposits remained protected, and that management operations were secure. I included a direct number for any tenant who noticed irregularities. Transparency was not weakness. When people trusted you with their businesses, their clinics, their offices, and their livelihoods, they deserved facts before gossip filled the silence. Jamal read the notice twice, made one small correction to the accounting language, and sent it through the tenant portal. For the first time since my birthday dinner, I allowed myself a cup of coffee while it was still hot. Jamal sat across from me, quieter than usual. I asked whether he regretted sending the evidence. He answered without hesitation, no. He regretted that his father had given him evidence worth sending. That distinction mattered. I told him he did not have to become hard simply because Desmond had been dishonest. Strength without judgment turns into cruelty. What Jamal needed was discipline, the ability to see facts clearly, even when emotion begged him to look away. He nodded, then returned to the audit queue. At 9:17, the receptionist called my private line. Her voice was controlled, but I heard the tension beneath it. 2 men had entered the lobby asking for Desmond. They had no appointment, would not provide company names, and had ignored her request to wait while she checked the schedule. One of them had placed both hands on the reception desk and asked where the owner was. I looked at Jamal. We both knew exactly who had arrived. The first payment on Chloe's $2 million private loan had been due at 9. The lenders had discovered that their borrowers were in custody, and now they were looking for the nearest person connected to the promised collateral. I told the receptionist not to argue with them. I asked whether she was safe. She said yes, but she had already pressed the silent panic button beneath her desk. Building security had been notified and was waiting in the corridor for my instruction. I thanked her and told her to remain behind the desk. Jamal immediately stood and said he would call the federal agent from the night before. I told him to have the case number ready, but not to summon anyone into the lobby yet. These men had come to deliver a message. I wanted to hear it before lawyers in uniforms turned the conversation into theater. Jamal frowned. Grandmother, they may be armed. I told him that possibility was exactly why we would not provoke them. I was not planning to threaten them, bargain with violence, or pretend their business was legitimate. I had no interest in pretending the lenders were victims of me. If they wanted to understand where their money had gone, they needed to stop looking at my tenants and start looking at the borrowers who had taken it. Then the leaner man said, Desmond had represented the Vance family as unified behind the transaction. He had claimed that temporary paperwork complications were being handled and that my signature could be obtained if necessary. I told him Desmond had lied. The conservatorship petition found in my home proved exactly how he intended to obtain that control. He and Chloe planned to have me declared incompetent, seize my portfolio, sell 2 smaller properties, and use my money to satisfy a debt they created without my consent. Their plan failed because they misread the ownership of Midtown and underestimated the paper trail they left behind. I asked Jamal for the second folder. He placed it on the desk. It contained information his audit had already uncovered about the people who actually benefited from the stolen funds. I opened it slowly and told the men that I was not offering them Vance Properties assets, tenant money, or access to any building under my control. I was giving them leads connected to their borrowers. The first pages listed accounts Chloe had kept outside the ordinary boutique books, including addresses and identifying information tied to secret offshore holdings referenced in her financial records. The next pages summarized hidden assets associated with Vivian that Chloe and Desmond had treated as part of their private financial safety net. The final section identified the warehouse where Chloe's boutique inventory was stored. The leaner man looked at me differently after that. He asked why I would hand over information that could hurt my own family. I told him family had already been used as an excuse for theft fraud and an attempt to erase my legal rights. I would not use the same word to protect the people who did it. Desmond and Chloe borrowed their money. Desmond and Chloe spent it. Desmond and Chloe lied about the collateral. If the lenders had a lawful claim to any assets actually belonging to those borrowers, they could pursue that claim through whatever process applied. But they would not touch Vance Properties, the Midtown tenants, or a single dollar held for people who had nothing to do with the scheme. The broad man asked whether I was threatening them. I said no. A threat would be unnecessary. The public deed, the federal case number, and the arrest record already defined the situation. I was setting a boundary. If anyone from their group entered Midtown, intimidated a tenant, interfered with building operations, or tried to collect against Vance Properties, every incident would be documented and added to the federal file. If they walked away from my company and focused on the people who actually signed their agreement, then there was nothing further for us to discuss. The leaner man studied the folder for a long moment. Then he gave a quiet laugh without humor. He said Desmond had described me as an elderly owner who no longer understood the details of her portfolio. Chloe had apparently assured them that once pressure was applied, I would sign whatever was placed in front of me. I asked whether I looked confused now. The broad man almost smiled. The leaner man did not, but some of the hostility left his face. He closed the folder and tapped the recorded deed with one finger. He admitted that someone on their side should have verified the current title independently. Greed, I told him, makes expensive people skip cheap checks. He asked one final question. Was the information in the second folder accurate? I told him Jamal had traced it from the same financial records that exposed the tenant deposit theft, but I made no promises about what remained available after the arrests. Chloe might have moved money. Vivian might have hidden assets differently. The warehouse inventory might already be subject to other claims. Those were their problems to verify, not mine. I had given them a direction. I had not guaranteed a recovery. The two men exchanged a glance. The broad man picked up the second folder. The leaner man returned the county deed to me, but kept a copy of the federal case number. He said they understood that Midtown was a dead end. He also said they did not appreciate being made fools of by borrowers who had taken $2 million under false pretenses. I told him we finally agreed on something. He nodded once, a small gesture that felt less like friendship than recognition. They turned toward the elevators. The receptionist released a breath she had been holding for nearly 10 minutes. Building security remained in the corridor and did not approach. Before the elevator doors closed, the leaner man looked back at me and said, Desmond should have learned more from his mother. I told him Desmond had been given every opportunity to learn. He simply preferred shortcuts. The doors slid shut, and the two men left with the folder pointing them toward Chloe's accounts, Vivian's hidden assets, and the boutique warehouse. They had arrived expecting to collect from me. They left understanding that the debt belonged to the people who stole their money. I closed the remaining file and told Jamal to return to the audit. Our company had survived another threat without surrendering a single tenant property or principal. 4 days after the spectacular collapse of their manufactured reality, the phone rang in my private corporate office. I was sitting at my large mahogany desk, reviewing the latest tenant occupancy reports for my commercial properties. Jamal sat directly across from me, meticulously cross-referencing the new security protocols we had installed across the entire company mainframe. The ringing of my private line pierced the quiet productivity of the room. I glanced down at the glowing caller identification screen. It displayed a generic automated number originating from the Fulton County Jail. I did not rush to pick up the receiver. I let it ring 3 times before I calmly pressed the speakerphone button so my grandson could hear the entire conversation. An automated voice cheerfully informed me that I had a collect call from an inmate. I accepted the charges. "Mom, is that you?" Desmond sobbed into the receiver, his voice echoing loudly through my spacious office. The sound of his weeping was immediate and incredibly dramatic. It was the exact same manipulative tone he used when he was a teenager, trying to avoid facing the consequences of his own reckless actions. He was breathing heavily, the background noise filled with the harsh metallic clanging of heavy jail doors and the shouted commands of corrections officers. "Mom, you have to get me out of here," Desmond pleaded, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "You have to post my bail today. They set it at $500,000 cash because I am considered a severe flight risk after the offshore accounts were discovered. You have that kind of money sitting in your emergency reserves right now. Please just write the check and bring it to the courthouse. I cannot survive in this place. I am a corporate vice president. I do not belong in a tiny concrete cell with violent criminals. They look at me like I am fresh meat. I am going to get killed in here if you do not bail me out before the weekend." I leaned back in my leather executive chair, folding my hands neatly on my desk. I listened to his frantic breathing for a long, silent moment. "You do not belong in a luxury suite using stolen funds to buy imported champagne." "Desmond," I replied, my tone completely flat and devoid of any maternal warmth. "I belong exactly where the justice system decided to put you. You committed massive corporate fraud. You endangered the livelihoods of hundreds of innocent, hard-working commercial tenants who rely on Vance Properties to keep their businesses running. You tried to hand my flagship building over to a violent crime syndicate. Therefore, you belong in a concrete cell. Mom, please do not do this to me. Desmond wailed, his desperation escalating into a high-pitched shriek. I am your only son. You cannot just abandon me in this hellhole. I will pay you back every single penny. I swear on my life I will work for free for the rest of my days to repay the bail money. Just get me out of this nightmare. I sighed softly, adjusting a file folder on my desk. You have absolutely nothing left to offer me, Desmond. You have no career, you have no assets, you do not even have a shred of personal dignity remaining. But more importantly, my liquid capital is currently entirely unavailable to you. My money is deeply tied up protecting the exact legacy you so carelessly tried to destroy. I am spending my massive cash reserves fortifying my legal defense, securing my commercial properties, and ensuring that not a single one of my tenants loses their business because of your monumental stupidity. You tried to sell my life entirely down the river to cover your own fraudulent tracks. I will not spend a single solitary dime of my hard-earned money to buy your freedom. You made a series of highly illegal choices. Now you get to sit in a jail cell and experience the severe consequences of those choices. Desmond let out a sharp, angry breath, realizing that his weeping victim routine was completely failing to move me. The sorrow in his voice instantly evaporated, replaced by a bitter, cornered rage. Fine, he snapped, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate growl. Put Jamal on the phone right now. I know my son is sitting right there in your office. Put him on the line, Beatrice. I glanced across the desk at Jamal. He had stopped typing on his laptop. He was staring at the speakerphone with a look of absolute steel. I did not say a word. I simply nodded to him. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood of my desk. I am here, Dad. Jamal stated, his voice carrying the exact same cold, authoritative weight that I used in business negotiations. Desmond seized the opportunity, instantly launching into a frantic guilt trip. Jamal, listen to me very carefully, Desmond demanded. You are my son. You carry my name. You owe me your absolute loyalty. You need to contact the federal agents right now and tell them you made a massive mistake. Tell them the digital evidence was corrupted. Tell them you hacked the mainframe and altered the documents yourself to get back at me for some petty family argument. If you withdraw the digital logs, the entire federal case against me falls apart completely. The prosecuting attorney will lose their primary piece of forensic evidence. You can fix this, Jamal. You can save my life. I gave you everything growing up. I paid for your clothes and your shelter. You owe me this absolute favor. Jamal let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. He leaned closer to the speakerphone, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding resolve. I do not owe you absolutely anything, Jamal replied, his tone sharp enough to cut through solid glass. You did not give me everything growing up. Grandmother gave us everything. Grandmother funded my college tuition at Morehouse. Grandmother provided the roof over our heads while you blew your paycheck on flashy cars and expensive suits, trying to impress high society elites who never even respected you. You spent your entire life pretending to be a self-made titan of industry, when in reality you were just a pathetic parasite feeding off the success of a black woman who worked 10 times harder than you ever did. Desmond sputtered furiously over the jailhouse line, trying desperately to interrupt. Jamal, do not speak to your father that way. I demand your respect right now. I am the reason you have a future in this business. You are the reason this business almost collapsed entirely. Jamal fired back, completely ignoring his father's pathetic attempt at asserting authority. You did not just steal from the company, Dad. You stole directly from the commercial tenants. You stole the security deposits from small business owners who trusted us. You tried to lock grandmother in a psychiatric ward just so you could steal her money to pay off violent mobsters. You have zero integrity. You have absolutely zero honor. You are not a businessman. You are a common street criminal who just happened to wear a nice suit for a few years. Desmond began to shout, his voice laced with pure venomous panic. You ungrateful brat. If you do not withdraw that digital evidence, I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again. I will ruin your reputation completely. Jamal did not raise his voice. He simply delivered his final crushing blow with absolute chilling precision. You do not have the power to ruin anything anymore, Dad, Jamal stated flatly. You are a disgraced criminal sitting in a tiny concrete box wearing an orange jumpsuit. Your career is permanently over. Your fake high society friends have already completely abandoned you. Chloe is currently sitting in the women's detention center, ready to testify against you to save her own skin. You have absolutely nothing left. You are a total disgrace to the Vance family name. You are a disgrace to everything grandmother built from the dirt. I am not withdrawing a single piece of evidence. I am going to sit in the front row of the federal courtroom and watch the judge sentence you to a very long time behind bars. Do not ever call this office again. The morning after, Desmond tried to manipulate his way out of a county jail cell. My grandson and I shifted our entire focus to damage control. We needed to ensure that absolutely no additional corporate funds were bleeding out through hidden channels. Jamal arrived at my executive suite at exactly 6 o'clock holding 2 large cups of black coffee and a secure encrypted hard drive. We had a massive task ahead of us. We needed to execute a deep dive forensic financial audit into my daughter-in-law's failed luxury retail business. I wanted to know exactly where every single stolen dollar from my commercial tenant security deposits had gone. Chloe always claimed her fashion boutique was an elite exclusive destination for Atlanta high society, but I knew it was truly nothing more than a shallow vanity project designed to massage her fragile ego. Jamal connected his laptop to my primary office monitor, casting his complex auditing software onto the large screen. He began methodically tracing the stolen $300,000. He tracked the illicit wire transfers Desmond had executed from the Vance Properties escrow accounts directly into the primary operating account for Chloe's business. For the first 2 hours, the financial trail was entirely predictable. Jamal showed me exactly how Chloe had immediately squandered the embezzled funds. She had not used the money to pay her suffering wholesale vendors or to improve her miserable retail inventory. She used the stolen capital to pay for imported marble display tables, custom silk window draperies, and a ridiculously expensive public relations firm. She was literally trying to buy her way into a social circle that secretly laughed at her behind her back. But as Jamal dug deeper into the hidden digital ledger, he noticed something that did not make any mathematical sense. He leaned closer to his screen, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. "Grandmother, look at this discrepancy right here," Jamal said, pointing to a secondary column on the master spreadsheet. "The $300,000 my father embezzled from your commercial accounts only covered Chloe's massive operating deficit for the first 6 months of the year. But her boutique has been hemorrhaging money for over 3 years. She has a dedicated monthly overhead of nearly $50,000 just to keep the lights on and pay her retail staff completely. Where did she get the capital to survive the previous 2 years before stealing from you?" I stood up from my leather chair and walked around the mahogany desk to stand directly behind my grandson. My eyes scanned the scrolling data on the large monitor. "You are absolutely right, Jamal," I agreed, my voice tight with sudden realization. "Desmond did not start stealing from my corporate accounts until about 6 months ago. He was too cowardly to cross me before then. Chloe must have had another secret revenue stream keeping her afloat. Find it right now. Follow the incoming cash deposits backward from the date of the very first fraudulent transfer." Jamal cracked his knuckles and began running a reverse trace on the boutique financial history. He cross-referenced the incoming cash flow against Chloe's personal banking statements. The silence in my corporate office was broken only by the rapid rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. 10 minutes later, Jamal suddenly stopped typing. He let out a sharp, shocked breath and sat back heavily in his chair. He stared at the screen as if he had just uncovered a completely devastating truth hidden in the digital code. "What did you find?" I asked, resting my hand firmly on his shoulder. Jamal slowly turned to look at me, his young face a mask of absolute disbelief. "She did not just steal from our company grandmother," Jamal whispered, his tone laced with pure disgust. "Chloe is a complete financial predator. She has been funding her fake luxury lifestyle by completely destroying her own mother." He tapped the keyboard, bringing up a heavily hidden folder containing a series of highly classified credit applications. I stared at the screen, taking in the horrifying reality of what my daughter-in-law had actually done. Before Desmond ever touched my commercial tenant deposits, Chloe had engaged in a massive, relentless campaign of identity theft. She had used her mother's personal Social Security number to secretly open 6 different high-yield premium credit lines. Vivian had excellent lifelong credit, built up from her late husband's modest estate, but Chloe had absolutely weaponized that pristine credit score against her. Jamal opened the transaction logs for each of the 6 secret credit cards. Chloe had systematically maxed out every single line of credit under her mother's name deliberately and ruthlessly. She used Vivian's stolen identity to purchase massive amounts of boutique inventory fund, her expensive international vacations, and pay for the lavish catering at her high society networking parties. The total balance across all 6 fraudulent accounts was an absolutely staggering $450,000. And because Chloe was the one intercepting the digital billing statements, Vivian had absolutely no idea that she was currently sitting on $500,000 of toxic high-interest debt. I stood frozen in the middle of my office, letting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. Chloe had not just bankrupted her own business. She had deliberately and maliciously bankrupted her own mother to maintain the shallow illusion of extreme wealth. My mind instantly flashed back to the upscale steakhouse in Buckhead just a few nights ago. I vividly remembered Vivian sitting on that velvet banquette, draped in expensive pearls, swirling her fine wine. I remembered the exact cruel sneer on her face as she looked down her nose at me while defending her criminal daughter. "Give the boy a break," Beatrice Vivian had said, her voice dripping with pure elitist venom. "You have to understand that Desmond and Chloe operate in high society. It is a completely different world from what you are used to. I know it is hard for you to grasp, considering you spent your best years knocking on doors in bad neighborhoods to collect rent money in cash." I felt a cold, dark sense of profound irony settle deep into my bones rapidly. Vivian had spent her entire evening mocking my blue-collar beginnings. She had publicly insulted the grueling, exhausting work I put into building my commercial real estate empire. She bragged about her pristine elite status, completely unaware that her own flesh and blood had already hollowed out her entire financial existence. The designer pearls around her neck were essentially bought with stolen money. The expensive luxury car she drove was probably one missed payment away from being aggressively repossessed by the bank today. "She has absolutely nothing left," Jamal stated quietly, breaking my train of thought. He brought up a final financial summary on the screen. "The interest rates on these 6 secret credit lines have completely ballooned. The minimum monthly payments are now officially exceeding Vivian's modest retirement income. And since Chloe is currently sitting in a federal holding facility facing 20 years in prison, she obviously cannot make the payments to hide the fraud anymore. The banking institutions are going to execute a massive collection protocol by the end of this week. They are going to seize Vivian's house entirely." I slowly walked back to my desk. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. Vivian spent her life judging others based entirely on class. She raised a daughter who valued a handbag over decency, and now that very same daughter fed her mother directly to the wolves. She will come crawling, begging for a lifeline. I will be perfectly prepared when she finally walks through my front corporate door today alone. It took exactly 4 hours for my prediction to become an absolute reality. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a new commercial lease agreement, when my secure intercom buzzed sharply. My receptionist sounded highly uncomfortable, telling me a woman in the lobby was crying hysterically and causing a significant scene. I knew instantly who it was. I instructed my receptionist to send the woman back to my private suite and asked Jamal to remain seated right where he was. The heavy mahogany doors to my office slowly swung open. Vivian stepped into the room, and the visual transformation was staggering. The haughty elite socialite who had sneered at me from a velvet banquette at the upscale Buckhead steakhouse was completely gone. In her place stood a broken, terrified woman who had just watched her entire manufactured world shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Vivian was not wearing her signature designer pearls today. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and improperly buttoned. Her hair, which was usually styled to absolute perfection, hung in messy, uneven strands around her pale face. She looked at me with wild, bloodshot eyes, clutching a cheap plastic shopping bag against her chest instead of her usual imported leather purse. The sheer magnitude of her financial ruin was written across her aging face. "Beatrice," she gasped, her voice cracking as she stumbled forward. Her knees buckled slightly, and she caught herself on the edge of my conference table. "You have to help me. You are the only person left in this city who has the resources to help me." I remained perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair. I did not offer her a seat. I did not offer her a glass of water. I simply watched her with the exact same cold, detached observation that a banker uses when evaluating a fundamentally bad investment. I folded my hands neatly on the surface of my desk. "What exactly seems to be the problem, Vivian?" I asked, my tone completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "Have you misplaced your corporate credit card today?" Vivian let out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed off the glass walls of my executive suite. She covered her face with her shaking hands. "Chloe ruined me," she wailed, tears streaming down her cheeks and ruining her expensive makeup. "My own daughter completely destroyed my life, Beatrice. The bank called me this morning. They froze all of my checking and retirement accounts. They told me I have over $450,000 in outstanding credit card debt. They said the accounts have been in default for months, and the late fees have compounded into an insurmountable sum. They are initiating active foreclosure proceedings on my house. They are going to take my home by the end of the month. I do not have a single dime to my name. I cannot even afford to buy groceries today." She leaned heavily against the wooden table, her shoulders heaving with genuine, unadulterated panic. "But that is not even the worst part, Beatrice. Those horrible, violent men showed up at Chloe's retail warehouse this morning. The loan sharks you redirected. They brought large moving trucks and they completely stripped the entire facility bare. They took every single piece of designer inventory, every piece of imported furniture, and every electronic device. They completely gutted the boutique. And then they called me. They told me that because Chloe used my personal address on some of her corporate filings, they will come to my house next if they do not recover the full $2 million. I am terrified, Beatrice. I am absolutely terrified for my life." Vivian finally looked up at me, her eyes begging for a miraculous rescue. She staggered across the room, closing the distance to my desk. She reached out with trembling hands as if she wanted to grab my arms, but the cold warning in my eyes stopped her dead in her tracks. "Please, Beatrice," Vivian begged, her voice dropping to a pathetic, desperate whisper. "I know we have had our personal differences in the past. I know we have never seen eye to eye on certain social matters. But we are family. We are bound together by our children and our grandson. You cannot let me end up on the street. You cannot let those violent criminals come to my home. You have millions of dollars at your disposal. You own commercial skyscrapers. A loan of $500,000 would be absolutely nothing to you. It would be pocket change. You could clear my fraudulent credit card debt right now. You could save my house from foreclosure today. I promise I will sign whatever legal documents you require. I will pay you back every single month for the rest of my natural life. I will do whatever it takes. Please do not turn your back on family." I listened to her pathetic, frantic pleading without moving a single muscle. The absolute audacity of this woman was truly staggering. She had spent decades looking down her nose at me, judging me for my skin color and my blue-collar roots. She had gleefully supported her daughter while Chloe actively tried to strip away my human rights and steal my entire real estate empire. And now, standing in the very corporate office she used to mock, she dared to invoke the sacred concept of family ties to beg for my hard-earned money. I looked at Jamal, who was watching Vivian with an expression of pure clinical disgust. Then I turned my undivided attention back to the weeping woman standing before me. "Vivian," I began, my voice slicing through her sobs with absolute lethal precision. "I want you to take a very deep breath and remember exactly where you were just a few short nights ago. I want you to picture the upscale Buckhead steakhouse. I want you to picture the vintage champagne you were drinking while my son fraudulently charged the bill to my company. Do you remember the exact words you spoke to me when I walked up to your table?" Vivian swallowed hard, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Beatrice, please, that was just a silly misunderstanding. I was stressed. I was just trying to protect my daughter." "You were not stressed, Vivian," I corrected her sharply. "You were cruel. You were deeply, intentionally cruel. You looked at me with absolute disdain, and you told me that I did not belong in your elite high society world. You looked down on the very foundation of my success. Let me repeat your exact words back to you so you never forget them. You said it was hard for me to grasp your sophisticated lifestyle, considering I spent my best years knocking on doors in bad neighborhoods to collect rent money in cash." Vivian flinched as if I had physically struck her across the face. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand, silencing her instantly. "You insulted the grueling, exhausting work I put into building this commercial empire," I continued, my voice rising with undeniable authority. "You mocked the very sweat and sacrifice that created the millions of dollars you are currently begging me to give you. You built your entire identity on the fragile illusion of legacy wealth while raising a daughter so morally bankrupt that she fed her own mother to the wolves just to buy a designer handbag. You thought you were fundamentally better than me because I had dirt on my hands while you wore pearls around your neck. So let me make my final position absolutely crystal clear to you today. I am firmly rejecting your request for a financial loan. You will not get a single dime from me. Get out of my office and do not ever return here again." Vivian did not move toward the heavy mahogany doors. She stood completely frozen, her chest heaving as the absolute finality of my words crashed down upon her. The remaining fragile pieces of her high society illusion shattered into dust right there on my expensive office rug. She let out a guttural, devastating wail that contained absolutely no theatrical flair. It was the raw, visceral sound of a woman realizing she was entirely out of options. She collapsed, dropping heavily to her knees. The cheap plastic shopping bag fell from her trembling hands, spilling a few crumpled receipts and a half-empty bottle of water onto the floor. "Beatrice, please," Vivian sobbed, pressing her hands flat against her face. "I have absolutely nowhere else to go. I have no friends left in this city. Every single person in my social circle stopped returning my calls the very second the news about Chloe broke. The bank is going to lock the doors to my house by the end of the week. I will be completely homeless. I am 65 years old. I do not know how to survive on the street. I will do absolutely anything, Beatrice. Please just tell me what you want me to do. I will scrub your floors. I will clean this office. I just need a way to survive this nightmare today." I looked down at the weeping, broken woman kneeling on my floor. I felt absolutely no pity for her, but I also felt no desire to inflict pointless cruelty. I am a pragmatic businesswoman. I do not deal in petty revenge or useless charity. I only deal in practical, sustainable solutions. I glanced over at my grandson. Jamal was watching the scene with cold, clinical detachment, perfectly mirroring my own expression. He understood that we were witnessing the absolute destruction of a parasite. I turned my attention back to Vivian. I slowly stood up from my executive leather chair and walked around my large desk. I stood directly over her, looking down at the tangled mess of her improperly styled hair. "Stand up, Vivian." I commanded, my voice firm and utterly devoid of emotion. "Do not kneel in my office. We do not engage in theatrical begging in this building. Get up right now and sit in that chair." Vivian scrambled to her feet immediately, her joints popping slightly as she pushed herself up from the floor. She practically threw herself into the guest chair across from my desk, wiping her tear-streaked face with the back of her trembling hand. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for my absolute final judgment. I leaned against the edge of my desk, crossing my arms. "I told you that I will not give you a single dime of charity, Vivian." I began speaking slowly and clearly, so she would not miss a single syllable. "I do not loan money to people who view me with deep underlying contempt. I do not bail out individuals who gleefully participated in the attempted theft of my commercial empire. However, you stated that you are willing to do absolutely anything to survive. You stated that you need a lifeline to avoid becoming completely homeless by the end of this month. Is that an accurate assessment of your current desperate reality tonight?" Vivian nodded frantically, her breath hitching in her throat. "Yes, Beatrice," she gasped, gripping the armrests of the chair tightly. "Yes, I will do anything you ask. I just need a way to pay for a tiny apartment and some basic groceries. I cannot live on the street. I will work for you. I will do whatever job you have available right now. I will prove to you that I can be useful. Please just give me a chance to earn a living wage so I do not starve." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch out for a long, heavy moment. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, Vivian." I stated, my tone razor sharp. "I am going to offer you a job today. It is not an executive position. It is not a managerial role. It is not a comfortable desk job where you can sit in an air-conditioned office and push paper around. I am offering you an entry-level minimum wage position within my commercial property management division. You will be assigned to one of my lowest-income residential housing complexes located on the far east side of the city. You will be my newest field collection agent starting this coming Monday." Vivian stared at me, her eyes blinking rapidly as her brain struggled to process the information. "A field collection agent," she repeated, her voice barely a hollow whisper. "What exactly does that entail, Beatrice?" "It entails exactly what you mocked me for doing in the 1980s. I replied, a cold, hard smile touching the corners of my mouth. "You will be assigned a designated route. You will physically walk from door to door in a working-class neighborhood. You will interact directly with everyday people who work incredibly hard to pay their bills. You will collect rent checks, log maintenance requests, and inspect properties for structural damage. You will walk up and down concrete stairs in the blistering Atlanta heat and the freezing winter rain. You will clock in at exactly 8 o'clock every single morning, and you will clock out at exactly 5 o'clock every single evening. You will report directly to a regional supervisor who is exactly half your age. You will be paid the state minimum wage on a strict biweekly schedule without any special corporate bonuses. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The horrifying reality of my job offer was sinking deeply into her elitist bones. I was forcing her to swallow every ounce of her toxic pride. I was forcing her to accept the exact same blue-collar labor she had spent her privileged life looking down upon. I was offering her the ultimate reality check. But Beatrice, she finally stammered, her voice trembling with suppressed panic, I am a senior citizen. I have never done physical labor. I have arthritis in my knees. Cannot I just work in the administrative filing department? Cannot I just answer phones for your team? I have excellent phone etiquette. I know how to speak to important clients properly. I can be valuable to your staff. Please do not make me walk the streets. I pushed myself off the edge of my desk and stood perfectly straight. You are not in a position to negotiate your survival, Vivian, I stated flatly. You do not get to dictate working conditions. You have zero corporate skills. You have zero leverage. This is the only employment opportunity you will ever receive from Vance Properties. You can accept this minimum wage field collection job right now, or you can walk out those doors and take your chances on the street. The choice is yours. Make it right now. Vivian looked around my luxurious office, searching for any sign of mercy. She looked at Jamal, who stared back with eyes as hard as flint. She looked down at her ruined designer clothes and shaking manicured hands. She realized with crushing certainty that her old life was permanently dead. She had absolutely no other way to survive. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Her shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. I will take the job, Beatrice, Vivian whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of profound humiliation. I will collect the rent. As Vivian left my corporate office, clutching her minimum wage job offer, I turned my attention to the federal justice system. The FBI Cybercrime Division processed the digital evidence. Jamal handed them immediately. By the end of the week, the United States Attorney handed down a massive, airtight federal indictment against Desmond and Chloe. The charges included multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. Because they used a federally protected historical property as collateral for an illegal street loan, their crimes carried mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. They were looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The terrifying reality of spending 2 decades behind bars fundamentally changes a person. It strips away the fake high society manners and exposes the desperate animal underneath. Desmond was the first one to completely crack under the immense pressure. He had spent his entire life taking the easy way out, and he was not going to change his core character when faced with a federal prison sentence. I received a confidential briefing from my legal team regarding the ongoing criminal proceedings. Desmond's desperate public defender had aggressively approached the federal prosecutors, looking to strike a favorable plea deal. My son tried to offer up his wife on a silver platter. Desmond claimed that he was completely innocent of the mortgage fraud conspiracy. He told investigators that Chloe was the sole mastermind behind the entire illegal operation. He painted a pathetic picture of himself as an overworked, stressed corporate executive who simply signed whatever administrative documents his wife placed in front of him. He claimed Chloe manipulated him, forging his signature on the final loan agreements and orchestrating the dangerous deal with the violent crime syndicate behind his back. He was trying to shave 10 years off his prison sentence by ensuring his wife took the maximum penalty. He genuinely believed he could charm the prosecutors by playing the oblivious, trusting husband. He forgot that federal prosecutors only care about paper trails. Chloe was absolutely not a helpless victim who was going to sit quietly and take the fall for her cowardly husband. While Desmond was busy trying to throw her under the bus, Chloe's defense attorney was simultaneously filing aggressive legal motions blaming Desmond for absolutely everything. Chloe's strategy was completely ruthless. She officially claimed that Desmond used his financial expertise and his vice president title to bully her into participating in the fraud. She painted herself as a naive, struggling boutique owner who acted entirely under the severe emotional and financial duress of her powerful corporate husband. She told the prosecutors that Desmond was the one who initially identified the legal loopholes in my corporate trust, and that he specifically forced her to approach the private lenders because he was too terrified to do it himself. The sheer level of absolute betrayal between them was staggering. Just a few weeks ago, they had stood united in my living room, confidently threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward so they could steal my millions. They had proudly operated as a cohesive criminal team when they thought they held all the leverage. But the very second the federal government locked them in separate interrogation rooms, their grand romance completely evaporated. Their toxic marriage immediately dissolved into a vicious cutthroat race to see who could send the other person to prison faster. They completely abandoned any pretense of family loyalty in a desperate, frantic bid for self-preservation. 2 months later, the federal judge scheduled a comprehensive pre-trial evidentiary hearing at the downtown Atlanta courthouse. Jamal and I arrived early, taking our seats quietly in the back row of the wooden gallery. We did not speak to the reporters lingering in the hallway. We simply sat together and waited for the legal spectacle to begin. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and the marshals escorted the defendants into the room. Desmond and Chloe were brought in through separate side entrances. They were wearing standard-issue Orange County jail jumpsuits. Their wrists were bound in heavy metal handcuffs, and chains rattled loudly around their waists. The transformation was absolutely shocking. Desmond had lost a significant amount of weight. His face was pale and covered in a thick, ragged beard. He looked incredibly old and completely defeated. Chloe looked entirely unrecognizable without her expensive highlights, her designer clothes, and her perfect makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her posture was slumped. The federal marshals directed them to sit at opposite ends of the wooden defense table. The moment they locked eyes, the sheer hatred radiating between them was palpable. Desmond glared at his wife with pure, unadulterated venom, his jaw clenched tightly. Chloe sneered right back at him, her lip curling in a mask of absolute revulsion. They looked like two starving wolves trapped in a cage ready to tear each other's throats out to survive. The federal judge, a stern, no-nonsense man, took his seat at the high wooden bench and banged his gavel to bring the room to order. The prosecuting attorney immediately stood up and began detailing the conflicting plea deals that both defendants had attempted to negotiate. The prosecutor read aloud the specific statements Desmond had made, accusing his wife of masterminding the fraud. Chloe sat at the table, shaking her head furiously and whispering angrily to her attorney. Then the prosecutor read Chloe's official statements, claiming Desmond was a manipulative bully who forced her into a life of crime. Desmond jumped out of his chair, shouting that she was a liar before the marshals forcibly pushed him back down. Jamal sat perfectly still beside me, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched his father and stepmother viciously attack each other in open court. He watched them completely destroy whatever shred of dignity they had left. I leaned over, keeping my voice to a bare whisper. "What are you thinking about right now, Jamal?" I asked. Jamal did not take his eyes off the pathetic scene at the defense table. "I am thinking about how absolutely pathetic they are," Grandmother Jamal replied, his voice cold and analytical. "They spent their entire lives pretending to be a powerful elite team. But the foundation of their marriage was built on nothing but greed and vanity. The moment real pressure was applied, their foundation completely crumbled. They have zero loyalty to anyone but themselves." I nodded in deep agreement, leaning back against the hard wooden bench. "You are absolutely correct, Jamal," I stated quietly. "When you build a house on shifting sand, you cannot be surprised when the walls eventually collapse." The federal judge grew tired of their bickering. He struck his wooden gavel, demanding absolute silence. He informed their defense attorneys that he was completely rejecting both of their attempted plea deals. The judge stated that the digital forensic evidence provided by the Cybercrime Division was so overwhelmingly clear that neither defendant needed to testify against the other. The prosecution had an ironclad case proving that they were both equally guilty and entirely complicit in the mortgage fraud scheme. The judge set the final trial date, denying their requests for reduced bail and ordering the marshals to return them to their holding cells. Desmond let out an agonizing groan, dropping his head onto the defense table. Chloe began to cry hysterically, realizing that her desperate strategy had failed. They were both going to face the absolute maximum penalties. As they were being led out of the courtroom, Desmond turned his head and looked directly into the gallery. His tired, hollow eyes locked onto mine. I simply stared back at him with a cold, calculating business demeanor. He swallowed hard as the heavy wooden doors swung shut, sealing it. The federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta was freezing cold, but the atmosphere was suffocating. I adjusted my tailored blazer and walked toward the witness stand. The rhythmic click of my heels echoed off the polished wood paneling. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and took my seat. The jury box was packed with ordinary citizens watching my every move. Desmond's defense attorney, a slick man with a sharp suit and a condescending smirk, approached the podium. He had spent the entire morning trying to paint Desmond as a helpless victim of a tyrannical mother. Now it was his turn to cross-examine me. Mrs. Vance, the attorney, began, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "This must be an incredibly difficult day for you. Watching your only son face a federal prison sentence is a tragedy. But we need to establish the truth about your state of mind. Is it not true that your family was deeply concerned about your cognitive decline? Did they not draft a medical conservatorship because you were acting erratically and making poor financial choices?" I looked directly at the attorney, refusing to blink. "They drafted a fraudulent document because they wanted my money," I replied calmly. "They claimed I was suffering from dementia so they could steal my commercial properties without any legal resistance." The attorney let out a loud theatrical sigh, shaking his head as he paced in front of the jury box. "But you were locking corporate accounts without warning," he argued, pointing a finger toward the defense table where Desmond sat sweating. "You humiliated his wife at a public restaurant. You behaved in a highly vindictive manner. And then you deliberately trapped your own son. You intentionally donated the Midtown building to a historical trust, knowing he would try to mortgage it. You set a trap to send him to a federal penitentiary because you are a bitter, unforgiving woman who resents her own flesh and blood. You orchestrated this entire scenario out of pure spite." I did not raise my voice. I leaned slightly forward, bringing my face closer to the microphone. The courtroom fell completely silent, waiting for my reaction. I did not set a trap. I stated, my voice resonating with absolute crystal-clear authority. I simply updated my asset protection protocols because I noticed massive, glaring irregularities in the tenant security deposit accounts. I locked the corporate cards because my son was actively committing corporate fraud. I transferred my flagship building to a federal trust because it was the most strategic way to protect my legacy from incompetent thieves. The fact that your client blindly forged documents and used federal property as collateral for an illegal street loan is not my fault. It is a testament to his own monumental stupidity. The attorney crossed his arms, trying to regain control of the narrative. He sneered, leaning heavily against the wooden railing. "So you expect this jury to believe that a 70-year-old woman acted completely alone. You expect them to believe you seamlessly outsmarted corporate executives without experiencing a single moment of cognitive confusion." I turned my head away from the slick lawyer and looked directly into the faces of the jury members. I wanted them to understand exactly who was sitting in front of them today. "You clearly do not understand what it took to build my portfolio," I said, addressing the courtroom. In the 1980s, Atlanta was a rapidly growing city, but the banking system was incredibly hostile. I was a young black woman trying to secure commercial loans in a real estate market dominated exclusively by men who refused to shake my hand. I faced predatory lenders who tried to bury me in toxic interest rates. I faced city zoning officials who threw my building permits in the trash. I faced relentless systemic discrimination every single day. Nobody handed me a trust fund. Nobody gave me a corner office. I had to learn how to read complex financial contracts better than the slick bankers who drafted them. I had to learn how to identify hidden clauses, shell companies, and fraudulent terms because one single mistake would have cost me my entire livelihood. I paused, letting the heavy weight of my history sink into the quiet courtroom. The jurors were completely captivated, hanging on to every single word. I survived 3 massive economic recessions. I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable strength. I bought rundown properties, negotiated with ruthless contractors, and transformed empty lots into thriving commercial centers. I did not survive decades in the cutthroat commercial real estate industry by being naive or forgetful. I survived because I learned how to pour concrete that cures harder than steel. I learned how to build absolute ironclad legal structures around my assets. So no, I did not orchestrate a vindictive trap for my son. I simply built a financial foundation that was completely impenetrable. I built a foundation too strong for rats to chew through. If Desmond broke his teeth trying to bite into my empire, that is his own problem. The courtroom erupted into a low, stunned murmur. The slick defense attorney opened his mouth to object, but he had absolutely nothing to say. He looked at the jury and saw immediately that he had lost them entirely. His entire defense strategy was built on portraying me as a frail, confused, elderly victim. Instead, he had just given me the perfect platform to demonstrate my absolute razor-sharp competence. The federal judge, a stern woman who had been presiding over the trial with a harsh, rigid demeanor, leaned forward, peering down at me over her glasses. For the first time during the entire proceedings, her expression softened into a look of profound, genuine respect. She had seen right through the pathetic lies Desmond and Chloe had tried to spin. The defense attorney shuffled his notes awkwardly, his hands shaking slightly. He tried to pivot to a new line of questioning, but his confidence was completely shattered. He stammered, asking a weak, irrelevant question about the specific dates of the corporate transfers. I answered him with flawless chronological precision, citing exact dates, account numbers, and legal statutes, without ever looking at a single piece of paper. With every factual answer I delivered, the fake dementia narrative burned to ash. Desmond sat at the defense table, staring at his shoes. He knew it was over. He knew the jury saw exactly what he was. He was not a victim of a cruel mother. He was a greedy, entitled criminal who had tried to destroy the very woman who gave him everything. I finished my testimony and stepped down from the witness stand. The silence in the federal courtroom was absolute. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with my head held extremely high. I did not look at my son. I did not look at his treacherous wife. I walked straight toward the back row of the gallery where my grandson Jamal was waiting for me. He stood up as I approached, a proud, confident smile spreading across his young face. He held my custom leather briefcase securely in his hands, representing the unbroken future of Vance Properties. We exited through the heavy wooden doors, leaving the crumbling wreckage of Desmond and Chloe's toxic marriage behind us in the hands of the federal justice system. The truth had finally been dragged into the bright, unforgiving light of a public courtroom. The jury would deliberate soon, but the actual verdict was already crystal clear to every single person in that building today. I had successfully defended my life, my fortune, and my hard-earned legacy. I proved loyalty matters more than blood, and my foundation will never break. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. In the complex world of federal financial crimes, 4 hours is not a deliberation. It is a swift and absolute execution. When the court clerk notified us that a verdict had been reached, Jamal and I returned to the heavy oak benches of the courtroom gallery. The air inside the room felt entirely different now. The arrogant posturing of the high-priced defense attorneys had completely evaporated. The slick lawyers were now packing their expensive fountain pens and leather-bound notepads with the quiet, frantic energy of men preparing to abandon a sinking ship. Desmond and Chloe were brought back into the room. They were not allowed to wear their tailored civilian clothes for this final appearance. They had been stripped of their designer suits and luxury dresses. They wore the standard-issue bright orange jumpsuits of the Federal Detention Center. Their wrists and ankles were bound in heavy iron chains that rattled loudly with every single step they took across the polished floor. I sat perfectly still, watching my son take his seat at the defense table. He looked completely shattered. His broad shoulders were slumped forward and his head hung low. He did not possess the courage to turn around and look at me. Chloe was trembling violently next to him. Her makeup-free face was pale and drawn. She kept whispering frantically to her attorney, but the lawyer simply stared straight ahead, completely ignoring her panicked questions. The massive wooden door beside the jury box swung open. The 12 men and women filed back into the courtroom, taking their respective seats. None of them looked at the defense table. That is the first thing you learn in a courtroom. When a jury refuses to look at the defendant, the verdict is always guilty. The federal judge entered the room, her black robes billowing slightly as she took her place at the elevated wooden bench. She struck her gavel once, bringing the tense room to absolute silence. She asked the jury foreman to read the verdict. The foreman stood up holding a single sheet of paper. On the charge of wire fraud, guilty. On the charge of corporate embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of identity theft, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, guilty. The word guilty echoed through the silent courtroom like a repetitive physical blow. With every single charge read aloud, Desmond sank lower and lower into his wooden chair. Chloe buried her face in her chained hands, letting out a loud, agonizing wail that the judge immediately ordered her to suppress. The judge did not waste any time scheduling a future sentencing hearing. Because of the overwhelming volume of forensic digital evidence and the sheer malicious nature of their crimes, she decided to deliver their sentences immediately. She looked down at the two defendants from her high bench, her expression devoid of any mercy or sympathy. Desmond Vance and Chloe Vance, the judge, began, her voice carrying a cold, heavy authority. You orchestrated a massive, sophisticated campaign of fraud. You deliberately stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent commercial tenants. You willfully forged federal documents to secure illegal loans from dangerous organized criminals. But your most egregious crime was the calculated, malicious psychological warfare you waged against your own mother. You attempted to weaponize the legal system to strip a perfectly healthy, competent woman of her fundamental human rights simply to cover up your own pathetic greed. The judge adjusted her reading glasses, her eyes locked squarely on my son. Desmond Vance, you are hereby sentenced to serve a mandatory minimum of 7 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. You will also pay full financial restitution to Vance Properties, and you will be permanently barred from holding any executive corporate position in the state of Georgia. Desmond let out a loud, guttural gasp, dropping his head onto the wooden table. 7 years. A federal sentence is not like county jail. There is no negotiating your way out early. He was going to lose the prime of his adult life, locked inside a concrete cage. The judge then turned her stern gaze to my daughter-in-law. Chloe Vance, you used your position to exploit federal properties and bankrupted your own mother in the process. You are hereby sentenced to serve 5 full years in a federal correctional institution. Upon your release, your failing retail business will be permanently liquidated by the state to pay the outstanding debts you accumulated through identity theft. Chloe did not scream this time. The absolute shock of the 5-year sentence completely paralyzed her. She stared blankly at the judge, her mind entirely unable to process the total destruction of her shallow, manufactured, high society life. The judge struck her wooden gavel a final time, officially closing the highly publicized trial. Court is adjourned, the judge declared, stepping down from the bench. The federal marshals immediately moved in to secure the prisoners. They grabbed Desmond by his shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. They did not treat him like a powerful corporate vice president. They treated him like a common, convicted felon. As the marshals turned him around to face the center aisle, Desmond finally lifted his head. His hollow, terrified eyes scanned the courtroom gallery until they found me. I was standing in the back row, holding my posture perfectly straight. I did not look at him with a mother's sorrow. I did not offer him a single tear of sympathy or regret. I looked at him with the exact same cold, unyielding business demeanor that had allowed me to survive decades in a cutthroat industry. But Desmond was not just looking at me. He shifted his gaze slightly to the right. Standing directly beside me, shoulder to shoulder, was his son, Jamal. Jamal was wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored dark navy suit. He looked incredibly mature, powerful, and completely in control. In his right hand, Jamal firmly gripped my custom leather corporate briefcase. The briefcase symbolized the absolute, unbroken future of my commercial real estate empire. It was the physical manifestation of the family legacy. Desmond stared at his son, and in that exact crushing moment, the horrifying reality of his situation finally caught up to him. The full weight of the 7-year federal prison sentence was devastating, but the realization of what he had truly lost was infinitely worse. Desmond realized he had not just lost his freedom today. He had not just lost his wealth, his luxury cars, and his high society status. He had permanently and irrevocably lost his only son. Desmond opened his mouth to speak, trying to form a desperate apology. He wanted to beg for forgiveness. He wanted Jamal to look at him with pity or sorrow, or even basic human compassion. But Jamal did not give his father a single ounce of emotional comfort. Jamal looked down at the chained, disgraced man being led away by federal agents, and his expression was completely devoid of love. Jamal looked at his father with the exact same cold, calculating business gaze that he had learned directly from me. It was a look of pure, objective evaluation. Jamal was looking at a bad investment that had finally been liquidated from the corporate portfolio. Desmond let out a pathetic, broken sob as the marshals forcefully shoved him forward, marching him out of the courtroom and into the dark holding cells. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him, echoing loudly. The trial was officially over, and justice was definitively served. We turned away from the empty doorway and walked out into the bright sunlight. We were absolutely completely ready to build our new corporate empire today. 6 months passed rapidly, bringing a fresh, vibrant energy to the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The commercial real estate market was experiencing an absolute massive boom, and Vance Properties was positioned perfectly at the very forefront of that incredible financial surge. I stood in my executive suite looking down through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the bustling city streets below. The air in my corporate office was no longer heavy with suspicion or the toxic, suffocating stench of familial betrayal. Instead, it vibrated entirely with pure, unfiltered potential and limitless opportunity. The heavy mahogany doors to my office swung open, and Jamal walked into the room. He was no longer just a brilliant college student balancing thick textbooks and late-night audit reports. He walked with the measured, confident stride of a seasoned corporate executive ready to conquer the global market. Today was a highly significant day for our family and for our expanding business operations. Jamal handed me the finalized contracts for our newest commercial acquisition, located straight in the downtown business district. I carefully reviewed the numbers, noting his flawless, impeccable attention to detail. He had completely restructured our entire tenant security deposit protocols, ensuring that absolutely no one could ever exploit our accounts again. I placed the signed contracts flat on my desk and handed Jamal a small dark velvet box. He opened it slowly. Inside rested a solid gold pen engraved with his full name and his brand new official corporate title, Vice President of Vance Properties. Jamal looked at the pen and then looked at me with deep, profound respect. He had earned every single letter of that powerful title through his absolute, unwavering loyalty and his brilliant forensic accounting skills. We had successfully purged the dangerous poison from our bloodline and secured the financial future of our empire for many generations to come. While Jamal and I celebrated our massive corporate expansion across the city, the people who tried to destroy us were experiencing a completely different, harsh reality. Across town, a heavy, freezing rain was pouring down violently on the low-income housing projects. Vivian was currently out there in the miserable, freezing weather. The arrogant woman who once draped herself in expensive pearls and cruelly mocked my blue-collar roots was now wearing a cheap plastic yellow poncho over a highly unflattering faded uniform. She stood shivering uncontrollably on a cracked concrete walkway, aggressively knocking on peeling wooden apartment doors to collect late rent payments in cash. Her expensive imported designer shoes had been replaced by cheap, practical waterproof boots that were currently covered in thick brown mud. She looked entirely miserable, exhausted, and completely defeated by the harsh, unforgiving reality of minimum wage physical labor. Every single time she knocked on a door and demanded a payment, she was forced to swallow the bitter, toxic pill of her own monumental pride. She finally understood exactly what it actually took to physically build the massive wealth she and her daughter had tried to blindly, effortlessly steal away. She had absolutely no high society friends left to rescue her from her miserable daily grinding routine today. Meanwhile, Desmond and Chloe were violently adjusting to their new restricted lives, permanently stripped of all their fake high society glamour and unearned corporate privilege. They wore identical coarse orange prison uniforms in their respective federal detention facilities located hundreds of miles apart from each other. Desmond spent his days sitting in a tiny, cold concrete cell, staring blankly at the gray cinder block walls, completely stripped of his imported tailored suits and his expensive luxury vehicles. He had lost his lucrative career, his stolen fortune, and the absolute respect of his only son. Chloe was forced to trade her exclusive fashion boutique and her lavish networking parties for a rigid, unforgiving daily schedule dictated entirely by armed correctional officers. Their toxic marriage had completely evaporated the very second they realized their illegal wealth was totally gone. They had gambled everything they possessed on a foundation of pure, unadulterated greed, and they had lost absolutely everything they ever had. They were permanently locked away in cages, meant for common criminals living endlessly with the terrifying consequences of their spectacular, massive failure. I walked slowly around my large desk and took a seat in my comfortable leather armchair. I placed my hands neatly on the armrests, feeling the solid, unyielding structure beneath my fingers. I looked around the beautiful, expansive office that I had built from absolutely nothing at all. I thought about the decades of grueling, exhausting work it took to establish my name in a ruthless industry that constantly tried to push me out. I had faced down predatory bankers, corrupt city officials, and deep systemic discrimination to secure my legacy. I had fought tooth and nail for every single dollar in my bank accounts and every single square foot of commercial property in my master portfolio. My own son actually thought he could bypass all of that immense sacrifice by simply forging a few corporate documents and throwing me violently into a locked medical facility forever. He drastically underestimated the profound, unstoppable, fierce strength required to successfully survive and actively thrive in this world as a self-made African-American woman managing massive, extreme financial wealth. I leaned forward carefully, resting my elbows firmly on the polished, shiny mahogany wood of my massive desk, taking a long, satisfying, victorious, deep breath. I turned my head slowly and looked directly into the camera, completely breaking the final barrier between my world and yours. I sincerely wanted to deliver one final, absolute, profound truth about what it means to perfectly protect your family legacy from those people who wish to deliberately tear it apart. They thought a 70-year-old black woman would just sit down and cry while they robbed her blind. They forgot that to build a skyscraper from the dirt, you have to know how to pour concrete that cures harder than steel.